It's going down, and you're invited for what they selling. We ain't buying. There is no running, there is no hiding. There's only fighting or dying. It's going down, and you're invited for what they selling. We ain't buying. There is no running, there is no hiding. There's only fighting or dying.
It's Going Down is a digital community center from anarchist, anti-fascist, autonomous, anti-capitalist, and anti-colonial movements. Our mission is to provide an autonomous and resilient platform to publicize and promote revolutionary theory and action.
Go to itsgoingdown.org for daily updates. Check out our online store for ways to donate, and rate and follow us on iTunes if you like this podcast. Okay, once again, we are joined with our legal correspondent. We're going to be talking about the recent huge eruption of not only protests, but also just the open question of what's going to happen in the Supreme Court. On Monday evening, Politico basically dropped a bombshell that they had leaked something from the Supreme Court that said they were getting ready to roll back Roe versus Wade. There's a whole bunch of legal questions that are tied up into this. That's why we're going to be sort of taking first like a legal look at this and just talk about how this could possibly play out, what it would look like, what it would mean for certain states to criminalize abortion access and reproductive freedom, and how that will possibly impact the terrain that we're going to see. So this is an internal draft majority opinion. What does that mean exactly?
It's confusing, and the language around the headlines on this is, I think, also confusing for people. The Supreme Court doesn't vote in the same way that, like, Congress votes. So when they talk about, the Supreme Court has voted, this isn't like a final binding vote. The way that they do this is that, they review all the written briefings in the case, and then they have oral arguments on the case, and then they do sort of a initial test vote to see which way the 9 justices are going on the case. And from there, they will start writing opinions. In this case, it appears that in that initial vote, which happened sometime after the case was argued, an oral argument last fall, they reached a initial majority opinion that said that Roe versus Wade should be overturned. And so the process is that, they write a majority opinion, and, other justices might write dissenting opinions or concurring opinions. And then they pass those different opinions around, and they revise their opinions, they attack the other opinions, and then there's, subsequent votes that happen. Sometimes justices will change sides, if they're persuaded by somebody else's argument. Sometimes opinions will, sort of narrow their ruling. In general and in theory, a lot can happen. What Politico said that is, somewhat interesting is that they had information that, this opinion, which was written in February, they had information that as of the time they were publishing it yesterday, on Monday, that this was still how the votes were breaking down within the Supreme Court. So even though it's, an opinion that was circulated 3 months ago, that this was still, what, 5 of the justices at the Supreme Court were planning on doing. The problem is that it's not final, and it's not an indication of what the law is now. Until the Supreme Court has actually issued an opinion, nothing is final and nothing has the force of law. And so it kind of creates this sort of in-between space where it's like, it seems like this is what they're doing, but they haven't actually done it yet. And so it creates both like alarm, but also hesitation. And I think that's been confusing for a lot of people, that like, has the Supreme Court done this or haven't they? Are they going to or aren't they? And so there's still these open questions that people are struggling with.
Let's talk about the leak itself. Do we know how this opinion got leaked? Is there a significance to it being leaked?
There's a lot of speculation about that, and we don't know at this time how it got leaked. I think a lot of people were initially, well, to back up, Supreme Court deliberations are notoriously secret. That, you know, they have a public oral argument, and the briefings that get filed are all public, but the actual deliberations of the court are notoriously extremely secret. And this is more by sort of internal custom and rule than anything that's like set in law or stone or anything. But everything that I've read says that it's pretty much unprecedented in the modern history of the court for a draft opinion to get leaked publicly. And I think a lot of people, their sort of first reaction was like, surely this got leaked by somebody that, you know, supports abortion rights and was outraged by this opinion and thought people needed to know, and maybe, you know, there needs to be pressure put on the court, and like, you know, somebody that sort of wanted to whistleblow and like stop this from happening, or sort of a last ditch effort to stop this from happening. But I've also, there's been a lot of, sort of analysis that suggests that it might actually be more likely to have come from, somebody against abortion rights, somebody on the political right of the court. And a couple reasons for that. One, it could be a way to blunt the impact of the actual opinion. That if you're going to roll back 50 years of reproductive freedom, it might be better to not do that all in one fell swoop. And so by leaking it, you sort of create this situation where there's a lot of confusion and uncertainty for people. You get some of the outrage out now while it's not quite real yet. And then when the actual opinion comes out, maybe it doesn't have the same kind of splash that it did. Maybe the protests aren't as lively or militant. Maybe it's, you know, not as disruptive. Also, I think the way it's leaked right now, you know, half of the articles, and, you know, the second thing in our interview here is about this leak and about the process and the decorum and the custom of the Supreme Court, rather than about the, you know, actual substance of what the court is doing to restrict bodily autonomy. And so it kind of diverts half of the discourse away from the actual issue. It's also been suggested that if, you know, if there's justices that are looking to maybe scale back this opinion or hedge their bets and create something that's a little bit more narrow, that this could create pressure on the right and sort of pressure them into sticking with a decision that fully overturns Roe versus Wade. Because the case that this is coming out of is a law out of Mississippi that only restricts abortion after, I believe, 15 weeks. And so it's possible, you know, again, in theory, it's possible that the court could write an opinion that says, you know, this 15-week abortion ban is legal, and we're not going to, you know, address the you know, core of Roe versus Wade right now. We'll save that for a different day. And so in a way, you know, if somebody on the right were to leak this, it could sort of trap the justices into their initial vote, to make them look like they're not bowing to pressure by, changing their decision or their vote. I know that there was recently a suggestion that Chief Justice Roberts was trying to, pull the right wing of the court a little bit more to the center and to try and write something that was more narrow. And so this could have been a move against, sort of a counter maneuver against that to try and pull it back to the right. So I think it's interesting. It's, a lot of, people on both sides of the aisle in mainstream politics are like, sort of the classic, like, we need to look into where this leak came from. We need an investigation, rather than focusing on the substance of, reproductive freedom, bodily autonomy, things of that nature.
Yeah, to your point, there's an article that just came out in the Washington Post today that said leading anti-abortion groups have been meeting with Republicans in Congress, and their plan is to push for, I think it's like a 6-week abortion ban if the Supreme Court stays with this decision to throw out Roe versus Wade.
Right. I mean, Texas has been under an effective 6-week abortion ban since September. And so, I mean, some parts of the country are already sort of living under this post Roe versus Wade universe. Other places, maybe there's a legal right to abortion still, but there's not actually any feasible access because of how far the nearest clinic is, or, various other barriers. So, we know that Roe versus Wade has never been, everything that the sort of white middle class feminists have made it out to be, that there's been major barriers to access for, as long as this decision has been in place. But we also know that things can always get worse, and the things that are bad can get even more bad.
Do we have any idea, how and when this would be implemented, what the next steps would be? Is there a timeline for this, that the Supreme Court will make a more public decision?
Yes, a little bit. I mean, I think anybody that was, following this and follows the Supreme Court generally was expecting the court to issue their final decision on this case, probably in late June. The Supreme Court has a kind of weird calendar, and they start their term in October and it ends at the end of June, maybe the very beginning of July in some situations. And so in big landmark cases like this, the decision that they release usually tends to be at the very end of the term. And so people were expecting the final decision to be, sometime between the second half of June and the first week or two of July. And so I think that's probably when we can still expect the Supreme Court to issue their final decision. I don't think that, some people have suggested that, the Supreme Court should issue a final ruling immediately because of the confusion that this has created. And I don't really see the Supreme Court doing that. Yeah, I just don't think that's very likely. And so, yeah, I think they'll stick with whatever their general schedule and general pace of doing things is. So I think we can expect a final decision on this, in the next month and a half to 2 months at the latest. And then, from there, once Roe versus Wade gets repealed, there's some things that happen immediately and some things that happen more slowly. I think there's 12 or 13 states that have what they call trigger laws. these are laws that have been passed that say this law only goes into effect if and when Roe versus Wade gets overturned. And obviously these are laws that basically prohibit abortion in any circumstance. And so, depending on the exact wording of the laws, but I mean, basically these trigger laws would go into effect in 12 or 13 states immediately. And so that's 12 or 13 states that the day after, maybe the day of a final decision that overturns Roe v. Wade, would completely prohibit abortion in that state. Other states, they'd have to go through whatever their legislative process is. Perhaps the governor could issue some executive order, but for the most part, they would have to pass a law through their Congress, and then the governor signs it, or they would have to do something through a ballot initiative. It's possible that, local municipalities could do something themselves, like a city that says we are banning abortion, within our city limits, to, restrict the ability of clinics to operate there. So, the timeline for that really varies, state to state according to their own, legislative process and the political will to do something there. I mean, several states would certainly, have very immediate consequences.
What penalties and legal hurdles would people face who would attempt to induce or carry out an abortion under this new regime? And of course, that would matter for what state they were at, because different states are going to have different laws. But if you can just kind of begin to answer that.
Yeah, I mean, the anti-abortion movement, the Christian fundamentalists, the, forced birth people, however you want to characterize them, have been pretty explicit about what this looks like when they get their way. Their slogan has always been that abortion is murder. And a lot of these statutes that, these trigger laws, the laws that these states want to enact, would make conducting an abortion murder. The same as if you walked out on the street and shot a dude in the face with a gun. And so that means that people that are, seeking abortions, carrying out abortions, teaching people how to do abortions, can very likely expect to be subjected to murder investigations and prosecutions, the same way as if they were, running an organized crime hit squad or something. And so the severity of this really, I don't think, can be overstated. The political right, the fundamentalists, I told somebody the other day that, they're going to investigate this like they investigate, Al-Qaeda and ISIS and the Unabomber and a serial killer sort of all rolled into one. And, it's pretty terrifying, that, life in prison, decades in prison, possibly even capital punishment, in some states if they went that far. I think there's been a bit of a shift in how the right likes to talk about it in past couple decades, that, they don't like to talk about punishing the people that actually receive the abortion, the pregnant person that decides to terminate the pregnancy. They talk about it more in terms of punishing the providers. But what we see is that, more and more, the pregnant person is the provider. People are self-obtaining and self-managing their own abortions through, long-standing herbal remedies, abortion medication that they obtain through various sources, things of that nature. People have been getting abortions for, time immemorial. This isn't like a new practice for people who get pregnant. This is something that goes back many generations, and, different cultures have different, traditions and practices around this. And so, but I think, just about a month ago or a few weeks ago, there was a woman in South Texas who was arrested and indicted for murder because she was alleged to have conducted a self-managed abortion on herself. And there was a pretty big public outcry, and the charges got dismissed, and the prosecutor put out a statement that there was no legal basis to charge her in the first place. But I mean, this shows that, even when there's not a law in place that makes it illegal, they're still trying to criminalize and punish women and other people who get abortions and who receive abortion care. And so I do think that there is a particularly significant risk to people that are, organizing to provide abortions, underground abortion networks. There's a lot of talk about like the Jane organization from back in the late 60s, early 70s that provided underground abortions before the Roe versus Wade decision. But I think it's important to realize, to not buy into the right-wing rhetoric that they're only going after providers, because they're absolutely going after women and other pregnant people as well. And, we know that when the state focuses its criminal enforcement power, it's always racialized. It's always based on class. It's always, around immigration status and around other signifiers of marginalization. And so we know, exactly which communities are going to be most heavily targeted, the most heavily policed. It's one more facet of, our white supremacist, classist system of policing in this country.
So in theory, people like giving out zines about herbal abortions, or people with access to the morning after pill, making those available, or even there's an anarchist group that makes like DIY medicines, like they just put out like make your own herbal abortions basically. Even that stuff could theoretically be criminalized, correct?
Yeah, I think the exact lines of it are unclear. At what point does sharing information go from, a free speech thing to a conspiracy to commit a crime or solicitation to commit a crime or something like that? Again, sort of analogizing it to, what we generally think of as murder. Like, at what point does telling somebody how to kill somebody go from sort of a non-specific, free speech sharing information, and when does it become a solicitation to commit murder or aiding and abetting the commission of murder? And so, these are lines that we don't know where exactly they will get drawn in the future, but there's definitely, the risk is bountiful.
Would a person still be able to travel to another state to get an abortion, or would that be illegal as well? Or that would, of course, matter from what state they were leaving from.
I think this is a really interesting issue. In the world before Roe versus Wade, traveling out of state was maybe not quite as simple for most people, unless you lived in the Northeast, where states are tiny and close together. Quick and affordable air travel, wasn't what it is today. And so I think this is an interesting an interesting question and an interesting area to sort of watch how it develops. I think it depends first on, where are they traveling from? If, let's say, this case came out of Mississippi, and, Mississippi's a pretty conservative state and has a trigger law that will make abortion illegal immediately. Mississippi could say that, the same as if you traveled out of state to murder somebody, they could investigate you in Mississippi for, let's say you planned with two of your friends to leave the state for the abortion. That could be a conspiracy that took place in Mississippi that gives Mississippi jurisdiction to investigate and arrest and prosecute that case. I think the question is, to what extent can that investigation go beyond the state of Mississippi? Connecticut recently passed a law that trying to sort of make their state a new haven for abortion access, pun intended there, by prohibiting their law enforcement and their legal process from being used by states that are trying to investigate and prosecute people for seeking abortions. And so saying that they won't extradite people to a state based on an abortion investigation, or won't let their law enforcement cooperate in an abortion investigation. And so does that prohibit or somehow interfere with Mississippi conducting their investigation and getting the evidence that they would need to prosecute that? Maybe, maybe not. There's a lot of things that go into an investigation. If they can't prove that, they were traveling out of state for this abortion, then, maybe they can't prove their, conspiracy that originated in Mississippi. You also think about, a lot of this relies on, subpoenas and warrants to tech companies to get, communications and travel information and credit card information, stuff like that. And so to what extent will, various tech companies or various corporations resist compliance with legal process that's seeking to criminalize and investigate abortion matters? Right now, there's not really any federal laws about abortion one way or another. There's been a lot of talk recently amongst Democrats, especially the more sort of liberal and progressive side of the Democrats, saying that Congress needs to pass a law that basically creates a statute in place of the Roe versus Wade decision, basically a federal law that says states are not allowed to restrict abortion rights. I don't know if that will come to pass. I think it depends partly on, what happens in the midterm elections in November. On the other hand, if or maybe when Republicans take control of the presidency in both houses of Congress again, like they did for the first 2 years under Trump, you can very, very easily expect them to pass a national law that says that in all states, even, California, New York, and Connecticut, abortion is illegal after 6 weeks of pregnancy, or, maybe is illegal always and forever, no matter what. So there's risk here even for people in, ostensibly blue, pro-choice, liberal states. I mean, I think it should be clear to people at this point that we don't live in a, real serious democracy, and we can't count on, any one political party retaining power, indefinitely. And so I think, there could come a time when some of these so-called, sanctuary states for abortion, are not as protective as they might want to be, depending on how federal legislation gets enacted.
I think this kind of brings up this really big question. We were talking about this before we started recording, but so for instance, what will the implications be for states that are trying to protect abortion access? So for instance, like California, they're talking about potentially like enshrining it in law, like other people have proposed. And other states, I'm sure, will say like, hey, if you want to get an abortion, you're more than welcome to come to our state. You know, that sort of remains to be seen, but that is possible. So then what happens when you have a state that is saying like, you know, we defend, you know, a person's right to choose. And then you have other states that are saying like, no, if you do that, if you go to that state, you're breaking the law and we will arrest you for murder. And one of the reasons that this is so important is this is sort of a very similar situation as to what happened in the lead up to the Civil War, where you had basically free states and slave states, and you had people going out and trying to capture folks and bring them back to other places, and you had states essentially coming into conflict with each other over those laws.
It's like you said, it's very much has similarities to the 1850s in the lead up to the Civil War, where you have anti-slave states in the North that are being expected to enforce the slave laws and the slave regimes of the slave states in the South, by, you know, returning fugitive slaves to the South and, you know, other issues like that. And it, you know, that was a big driver of some of the tensions leading up to the Civil War. I mean, like the Connecticut law that I mentioned, you know, a world in which some states are refusing to cooperate in the investigation of what another state considers to be murder, refusing to extradite people, refusing to honor legal process or legal judgments from those other states. You know, that's kind of a pretty wild step outside of how things have worked in the United States legally for a really long time. And it's easy to imagine this, you know, sort of creating a atmosphere of sort of tit for tat retaliation between states, that if Connecticut says they're not going to extradite this person to Mississippi on what Mississippi considers to be this like capital murder charge, you know, how does Mississippi respond to that? What do they do in retaliation to Connecticut for that? And so it really sort of strikes at some of the core legal customs that have held the United States together for 200 years. Is that a bad thing? I don't know. You know, I'm not, you know, I think that's sort of an open question as to like, you know, even if you agree that the United States should be abolished, it's like in what way and in what fashion and who's running the game, because like right now it seems like if the United States were to fall in a civil war, it would be the, you know, reactionaries that had the upper hand in a lot of respects. And so does that just create like a you know, plurality of hyper reactionary, hyper nationalist like theocracies across, you know, the land that was once the United States? I don't know. That's kind of, I'll leave that for the speculative fiction writers and the political theoreticians.
You know, it's pretty clear that, you know, the vast majority of people or the majority of folks in the United States are in favor of abortion rights and abortion access.
Absolutely. I mean, I think there's different lines that can be drawn around exactly when and to what extent, but all of the numbers show that in, you know, at least some circumstances, people should have a right to get an elective abortion. And this is something that's been pushed by, a very narrow but very intense and active and effective political movement from the far right for 50 years now that is finally, I think they've been reaping some benefits for a couple decades, but I mean they're finally like on the verge of what they consider to be a total victory. And they've done this most recently. I think a lot of the attention has been on their sort of legislative and judicial efforts, but it's been a true diversity of tactics on their part, that everything from assassination and kidnapping and bombing campaigns and street protests and civil disobedience, up to the, stacking courts with their nominees and, single issue voters and electing people based solely on their stance on abortion. And so it's really run the gamut, and somehow they've, since the 90s, they've managed to rehabilitate their image so that, I think a lot of people have sort of forgotten that, like, oh, these are the same people that, like, not that long ago were just murdering doctors, because they were, allegedly quote unquote pro-life.
So I guess this brings up the question, what would the repressive apparatus to go after and arrest people look like, and how would that be implemented? What agencies would be carrying out these arrests? Would they have to create like a new sort of like interstate agency to arrest people for essentially reproductive crimes? Or this would be like state police, regular police?
I think it would be the same police agencies that we already see. And so, if you get an abortion in Lubbock County, Texas, it's going to be, the Lubbock County Sheriff's Office that's investigating you, and the Lubbock County District Attorney's Office that's prosecuting you, and, the district court in Lubbock County that convicts and sentences you, and then you'll go to the regular, Texas Department of Criminal Justice prison that incarcerates you. I think that there are, again, looking at sort of how this creates tensions within and between different geopolitical entities, you can imagine that, like, even in a state like Texas or a state like Mississippi, maybe the prosecutor in Jackson, Mississippi says that, I'm a leftist. I'm not going to prosecute abortion cases. Or, the district attorney in Houston says that, we're not going to prosecute abortion cases here because, my constituency is all Democrats, and so I don't want to offend them. But will the state government task, part of their attorney general's office or part of their state police with investigating and prosecuting these crimes in place of local police that are unwilling to do it? I think that's, again, another one of these open questions that, I don't know that even the political right has an answer for yet. I think that they're sort of taking this a little bit one step at a time, that they've been fighting 50 years to overturn Roe versus Wade. And once they've got that under their belt, they're going to be like, well, what can we do? What can we do next? How can we make this victory go as far as possible, both in terms of restricting abortion, criminalizing abortion, punishing people for, seeking and obtaining and providing abortions, but also in terms of like what else on our sort of agenda list can we use this to attack and undermine?
Yeah, I think the next feasible step, like you said, would be more criminalization, but also gay marriage, And they've prepped the groundwork for that so hardcore with all this talk about groomers and, going after Disney.
And so it's hard to shake a stick at, what's the most terrifying about this this looming reality that we're facing. But, one piece of it is that, the rationale that Justice Alito uses in this draft opinion for overturning Roe versus Wade is that, he says that the Constitution doesn't say anything about abortion. And so this is something that should be left to the states. And it's like, well, the Constitution doesn't say anything about a lot of things that we sort of take for granted as like rights that we have. And the right to abortion is very much tied up into the right to privacy. The Constitution doesn't say anything about a right to privacy. This is something that, the Supreme Court and judges have sort of read into the Constitution and sort of like inferred. But if that's something that this new, super right-wing majority on the Supreme Court is no longer willing to do, and is willing to sort of roll back all the precedents that are, based on a right to privacy, that includes, the right to, consensual sodomy, any sort of like basically non-procreative sex. That decision, Lawrence versus Texas, was decided under the right to privacy, the right to watch, pornography in your home, right to privacy issue. Gay marriage was not specifically a right to privacy issue. It was a due process issue. But again, Constitution doesn't say anything about marriage. It certainly doesn't say anything about gay marriage. And so, to what extent are they using this to, set the stage for, all sorts of other things that they're looking to repeal and to recriminalize. And, I also think it's notable, like, constitutional protections around forced sterilization are kind of a little bit weak, but, a government and a judicial branch that can say that you don't have any right to terminate a pregnancy, that you like have to carry a pregnancy to term, is also in a very good position to say that like you don't have any right to get pregnant, and the forced sterilization suddenly becomes on the table in a way that like it just hasn't been in recent history. And again, looking at the history of like who gets targeted for sterilization, indigenous communities, black communities, poor communities, people with mental health issues, people with criminal records, people with disabilities. These are, the communities that get targeted for these sort of like eugenicist policies. So I think that, the world in which the court doesn't think that there's any constitutional basis for making a private medical decision about what to do with your body is, I think a frightening future for, everybody, regardless of, your particular opinion about abortion or your particular need to ever get an abortion. It's definitely a harbinger of some serious doom ahead.
So from a legal perspective, are there legal mechanizations in which it would make sense for people to direct their energy towards in terms of protest, dissent?
This is clearly a legal problem, but I actually don't think that there's like a legal solution to it. I think that the legal establishment sort of suffers a lot from its own mythology and its own delusions around its like non-political nature. And, people talk about like, oh, this is going to this is going to make the Supreme Court look like just another political body or something. And it's like, in what stupid universe do you live in where the Supreme Court is not just a political body? I know that there's this this legal mythology that somehow the law is above politics and the Supreme Court is above politics or something. But I think regular people that aren't sort of indoctrinated into that nonsense can easily see through that. And, critical legal studies, critical race theory, these have all been demonstrating the inherently political and ideological nature of law and justice and judicial process for, as long as Roe versus Wade has been around. So yeah, I don't think that there's like a legal solution to this problem. I think it's a problem of political power in the broadest sense, not in terms of partisan politics necessarily, but like where is power built in society? And so, I think we need to be talking about like movements and communities and people and organizing power on those levels. Because that's what's gonna bring us to liberation, not a legal strategy, obviously. And so, where I think the pro-choice movement has suffered from a number of missteps over the years. I think, over-reliance on the Democratic Party that has been extremely complicit in the, stigma against abortion. Joe Biden was like a longtime supporter of the Hyde Amendment that prohibits any federal funding going towards abortion or abortion care. Tim Kaine, who is Hillary Clinton's running mate, also a longtime supporter of the Hyde Amendment. So these are people that are like high up and like literally leading the Democratic Party that like made their entire careers out of like restricting abortion access and creating stigma around abortion. And so they can say all they want now about like protecting the right to choose, but it's hypocritical and it's hollow and it's political pandering basically. What some friends of mine say is that, politicians follow movements, not the other way around. And so I think another piece is that it's hard to find, targets and symbols for a protest or direct action movement, on this issue because it's, if you're protesting police violence, you go to the police substation or the police union headquarters or, the contractor that's, selling police gear or, the police cars or, there's a lot of these like, ready-made, symbols and locations. And there really isn't that for this sort of right-wing movement. A lot of the right-wing movement is organized through churches, and it's, say what you want about it, it's not really that socially acceptable to be targeting churches for protest and direct action and obstruction and civil disobedience and things like that. And so I think it sort of creates a bit of a conundrum for like how you organize and direct these movements. But there was an article in The Nation a couple months ago sort of discussing the difference between the pro-choice movement here in the United States that in many ways feels like it's failing, and pro-choice movements in a number of Latin American countries that seem to be winning major victories recently. And one of the arguments that it made is that, in a lot of these Latin American countries like Mexico, the feminists and the pro-choice movements, were always based in sort of grassroots street politics and hadn't gotten caught up in like these institutions like not big nonprofits and lobby organizations and political parties. And that, that's where their power came from. And that's where U.S., pro-choice, movements have faltered. So, I think there's a lot that can be, gleaned and learned from the movement against police violence after George Floyd's murder in 2020. I think standard sort of movement protest lessons 101 is, creating a crisis, creating a political crisis. And, the protests after George Floyd's murder did that in a really, really dramatic and spectacular way. And I think that there's a lot of lessons that people can take to heart from that.
In what ways do you think that this will impact, a lot of the stuff that the Republicans are doing beyond just attacking abortion access? So, for instance, like all of the anti-LGBTQ bills, especially attacking, trans youth and so on.
I think it's definitely going to create momentum for the far right. The issue of, abortion access and healthcare for trans people, I mean, these are, very deeply linked issues that center around bodily autonomy and, bodily autonomy for marginalized and oppressed communities in particular. And, suffice it to say that, like, sort of going back to what I said, if there's no constitutional basis for protecting somebody's right to make a private medical decision about their body in regards to abortion, then there's no constitutional basis for protecting somebody's right to make a private medical decision about their body in regards to, gender identity and gender expression either. So I think that the pro-choice movement, the abortion rights movement has made some good steps in terms of including a queer and trans analysis, but I think that there's also still a long way to go. There's still a lot of sort of second wave radical, so-called radical feminists with a really essentialist view of gender that is really trans exclusionary and transphobic, and so I think that there's definitely a lot of room to develop that further, because these two issues really they really live or die together in a lot of ways.
Well, I guess the last question is just we've already sort of touched on a little bit, but I mean, your thoughts on how the Trump base will respond to this, both, far right neo-fascist groups, also just like regular Trump supporters. We already talked about how this is sort of energizing the base. Today we saw Proud Boys out at a demonstration at the University of North Texas. I'm sure as things go on, if the demonstrations do go on, that we'll see more and more far-right groups sort of mobilize against those, just like with the George Floyd demonstrations. Yeah, I'm just curious, any other thoughts you have? I mean, especially just, on the other side too, because I think we're also seeing a whole new generation of youth probably come into the streets for the first time that maybe saw the George Floyd uprising take place 2 years ago, and now they're seeing this.
In places where there does remain abortion access, it's easy to imagine that, right-wingers will escalate their attacks in various ways on people that are trying to protect that access and provide that access. I think that, you mentioned the crossover between the anti-choice movement, the anti-abortion movement, and white nationalist movements. I think that we will continue to see more of that crossover, more of that interplay. The white nationalist movement definitely sees anti-abortion activism and organizing as again, pardon the pun, but fertile recruiting ground for their sort of fascist causes, because there's a lot of ideological overlap between these movements. On the left, I think it is going to energize and radicalize people, but I also think it's going to create, a lot of hardship and a lot of, trauma and a lot of, really negative impacts on people too. I think that there's a steep learning curve about how to, scale up our efforts at providing reproductive health care for people in a manner that has to be clandestine and underground, because it's being, actively hunted and actively targeted by, the full weight of the state's repressive apparatus. And so, that's resource intensive work. And, if there's any silver lining in, this decision getting leaked when it did, it's that it, I think it's serving as a bit of a wake up call for people that had maybe been clinging to some hope that things might turn out differently. And, hopefully, people can use that sort of advance notice, that warning shot, so to speak, to be a bit better prepared for when the final decision does come down. Because, people that have been following this and people that have been organizing around this and paying close attention, have been saying basically since Amy Coney Barrett got confirmed to the Supreme Court that the days of Roe versus Wade are numbered. And if it didn't get overturned in this way at this time, it was going to be in this other way at this other time in the not too distant future. And so we're sort of coming up against the deadline on that. And it's horrible and it's tragic, and we're going to see people suffering and dying and going to prison unnecessarily because of it. But I'm hoping we'll also see, new networks of resistance and new, infrastructure for, caring for each other in a way that's, illegal and secretive, that, we haven't necessarily had to do before, but now we do.
Just for folks that, like you said, maybe not have, maybe hope is the wrong word, but sort of had the idea that at least the Democrats are there to kind of provide this sort of basic defense against, attacks on Roe v. Wade. And, like you said, what we're seeing is that they're not only not able to do that, but they're not even willing to do that. And also too, they're so terrified of the working class getting out of control that they are completely opposed to mobilizing on people. And whereas the far right really feeds off of, extra legal violence and calls upon it and invites it and encourages it, the Democrats are just terrified of just everyday people going buck wild and getting organized.
Yeah, absolutely. The Democrats are focused on trying to manage every single thing, and keep everything contained. And whereas, we're talking about the Supreme Court, Justice Thomas's wife is, being revealed to have been texting the White House begging the president to, basically disregard an election and overturn an election. And and this is the high profile wife of, one of the people that's, voting to cast aside any semblance of bodily autonomy. And so I think it really where their heads are at in terms of like their vision of authoritarianism and control and oppression, for everybody. And, I think the abortion issue is, the one that they've mobilized around, but I think, like we've talked about several times, it trickles out into all of these other broader issues. And, I think, the core of the anti-abortion movement, they're not content to ban abortion. They're not going to be content until, they've banned sodomy, banned contraception, banned pornography, anything other than like the most strict and repressive and like, constrained version of sex and sexuality that you can imagine.
Hi, I'm Natasha Lennard. I'm a columnist at the Intercept, and I teach critical journalism at the New School in New York.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us once again. We're going to be talking sort of loosely based on an article that you posted on the Intercept, said the end of Roe, saving abortion rights means taking them into our own hands. Let's start off just what are your thoughts on last night? So we saw thousands of people take to the streets across the U.S. What are you thinking right now?
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's, I think it would have been really disturbing had the, SCOTUS opinion leaked and then there not have been thousands of people taking to the streets, particularly outside courthouses nationwide. Pretty much in every state. So I think it would have been a real worrying absence had that not happened. At the same time, and we've seen this at various kind of stark or striking political moments. There's the kind of broader shock for, many thousands, hundreds of thousands of people who perhaps weren't paying close attention to the trajectory of this kind of fascist creep, of the kind of long and well-established victories of the Christian right, for whom, the end of Roe was this like earthquake, didn't expect it to happen, hadn't been paying attention to the ways in which we've been, much of the country is already living in a post-Roe world without access to abortion. So, in that moment of shock that, even those of us who've been well expecting that could nonetheless feel there's this kind of rush to a demonstration, to a protest. It's a good impulse. It's good when people kind of come together, but I think we've seen too many times what it can look like when people feel that it's an end in itself. Like we stood up and had things and joined and then marched around a little bit in predictable parade routes through certain cities and went home. For an issue like abortion access and resisting, the ways in which these kind of fascistic moves against bodily autonomy are only going to go further and further, there's of course a limit to turning up to a kind of benign, quite placid protest. In certain cities there were clashes with police. I'm thinking of Los Angeles in particular. New York was particularly placid. I don't want to sound judgmental, but obviously, the kind of organizing and collectivity and pressure creation that is necessary at this moment, is certainly far beyond, anything we saw last night. And I'm, somewhat heartened by the fact that what I've heard from a number of people today and what I've seen on social media a lot today is people kind of trying to think about how to build upon existing abortion access, abortion fund networks, abortion pill access, and how those of us in abortion protected states can assist with that. And that kind of thing, I think, is a lot more useful than just the kind of short-lived, there was shock today, let's go stand outside an obvious, state capitol building or courthouse.
There's some graffiti that's sort of gone around virally on social media where it says like, liberals, you said you would riot if Roe v. Wade was overturned, pay up or something like that. I'm just curious if you can comment just on that sentiment from a lot of, I guess, self-described liberals and progressives that basically like there would be a line that could be crossed in which, they would be more disruptive. Did we see that? Did we not see that?
Oh, yeah. Well, look, of course we didn't see that last night. Last night was not a night of uprising. It was a night of, I think, togetherness and demonstration, but certainly not anything truly rebellious for the most part. And I would have been surprised had it been. Yes, of course, this wouldn't be the first time where, liberals have historically proclaimed that there is a red line somewhere, and that, of course, they see themselves as the kind of subject that, when the time comes, would, of course, rise up. Notably, I wouldn't imagine that very many of the people who make those kind of proclamations in a futural sense of it's never quite arrived also joined in the streets in the 2020 uprisings. I don't remember seeing a lot of liberals rioting then. So this is why it's a kind of, it's a facetious, but I think apt dig. Liberals, can we riot now? And it was the same way when Trump was elected. There was we'll get in the streets and we'll stay in the streets and this cannot stand. And there was some, ferocious and potent protest during that time. Nothing again compared to, the Black proletarian led 2020 uprisings. But, after November 2016, there were lots of big protests and people, shouted fuck Donald Trump like they were shouting fuck Eric Adams, which you love to hear it, in New York last night. But it didn't signal to me a kind of touch point moment of, there's no going back. Everyone's taken to the streets now. We're in a moment of uprising. Like, I'm not seeing that. And I would be, wishful thinking to say that. I think what's, for those of us who are keen to see a kind of radical, at most points keen to see, radical shifts and embraces of that kind of thing, it's useful, I think, when people are pointing to the mass feminist movements for abortion in Latin America, and there was even people saying wear green, which we saw in a lot of the protests, was supposed to be a kind of gesture to that. But I think it would also be unrealistic to suddenly pretend we have that kind of mass of radical feminist protest willing to take to the streets, stay in the streets in militant ways at this moment. Like, that would be kind of foolish of us. But, that doesn't mean I don't think we're going to see some really important collective action taken and, some perhaps unexpected galvanizing towards a more militant standing, or at least acceptance of militant action from, previously more kind of centrist liberals. But, I'm not making any grand predictions in that direction because that would be unempirical.
Biden's marching orders to the rank and file is just, go out and vote and give us money and hope for the best, which of course is like, you already have the presidency, you have both houses of Congress, what have you done? You haven't done anything. You touch about this in your article as well. Oh
yeah, I know. I described them as the Democratic Party as feckless, and given the refusal to break the filibuster, the only way in which, a national abortion protection law could ever be put on the books within this congressional term, the Democrats are kind of approaching holding as much blame as the violent Christian right, who have had an abortion ban as a kind of wish, which they have fulfilled at ever kind of starker rates. I think no Democrat can be forgiven for this. And sure, we can point to Bernie and others on the left flank who have tried to urge that the filibuster be broken and that nationwide abortion protections and voting rights acts get codified. And if we don't see this happen before November, and in the, very real possibility that Republicans, sweep and take back Congress, and if they do so in significant enough numbers, we shouldn't think for a second that they're not going to try and pass a nationwide federal abortion ban. Claims about states' rights be damned. Like, that's the goal. That's the right-wing goal. And to watch Democrats be so feckless is, of course, wildly infuriating, and I think should infuriate everyone. I mean, here's the rock and the hard place, though, right? In the fear that there would be a Republican sweep in November to the extent that they would then have the numbers in Congress to pass a nationwide abortion ban, people will, nonetheless, them having done absolute fuck all, people will turn out with kind of fear-based votes to keep the Democrats as much in power as they can. So it's completely undeserved, but it's just once again another kind of set of conditions wherein people vote against the greatest evil to a really quite significant evil. And I understand that. Like, we don't want a nationwide abortion ban, but that's why at this particular moment, I'm all for making Democrats' lives hell to push them to end the filibuster and pass, nationwide abortion protection laws. Sure. But, I would have no faith in that. We have no reason to have faith in any of these politicians who claim to care about our bodily autonomy. So we have to be organizing differently if we actually care about people getting abortions who need them.
Yeah, it's interesting you brought up, people voting in fear. Other folks have chimed in on social media about, will the Republican base turn out in mass numbers to vote for Republicans basically as a thank you? Like, I guess which base will be more motivated? One out of joy that something they fought for so long is being passed, and the other one out of fear that, like you said, there's an article in the Washington Post actually that talks about, their plans for a nationwide ban, which I think is centered around like after 8 weeks or something like that.
Yeah, which would be, just an abortion ban in this entire continent-sized country. It's hard to know which, whether fear-motivated votes or, fascioid pandered base-motivated votes will, bring more, will kind of win over in November. I'm not a pollster. But yeah, there's no doubt that, Republicans from their think tanks downwards have been far better organized, at this point for decades. And that is, evidently something that Democratic establishment has no interest in learning from. But we should be acutely aware of it and know the kind of power of the enemy is not insignificant.
As a lot of people sort of get disenchanted with the Democratic establishment, what do you think people should be doing to kind of like fill that void, to basically say like there is actually something we can do, there's a lot to do?
Yeah, obviously, this particularly around the issue of, abortion rights, I think, people who are like, clearly the Democrats aren't going to save us. And if this is the first moment people are realizing this, I feel there's a desire to be like, oh, welcome aboard. You just got here, but that's not helpful. Obviously, like people finding disaffection with, mainstream liberalism. Those are people that make potential allies and co-conspirators, in the right occasions. So the important thing is not, I think people who might be in that, situation, I'm not sure they're going to be listening to us right now, but if you maybe know people, I think that what's important is that, the kind of go-to move of, well, why don't we give money to Planned Parenthood? That's not something that should be embraced right now. It's notable that Planned Parenthood has quietly stopped providing abortions in Georgia and Alabama already, based on, local legislation that's passed there. That's not acceptable. These are the front lines. But there are groups who have been organizing on the front lines, paying people's bail funds, ensuring that, abortion fund money is apportioned where it needs to be. And I think these are the groups that we need to be following. We don't need to kind of reinvent the wheel here. There are networks, because there are, dozens of states in this country where abortion access is already highly limited, if not non-existent. Of course, there are, groups on the front lines in these states who have been working with and on behalf of pregnant people, women and pregnant people, all this time for the many years that this attack has been, raged against our bodily autonomy. And, for example, the horrifying case that made a lot of headlines, rightly so, I believe it was last month in Texas, when a young woman called Lizelle Herrera was arrested and originally charged with murder in connection to her self-induced abortion. And this was just a kind of, overzealous sheriff's office, essentially, who were like, we'll charge her with murder. Turns out right now in Texas, there is not a murder statute with which you can charge the pregnant person for an self-induced abortion. So the charge couldn't stick because there's no such law. But again, we're seeing these laws changing at great speed. So who's to say that that's not the next step, and indeed very feasible in a fully post-Roe world. But notably, it wasn't Planned Parenthood who were paying Lizelle Herrera's bond. It was local groups and existing efforts who are making abortion access a reality in Texas. And those sort of abortion funds that those of us who are living far away, who are in currently abortion supportive states, need to be focusing our effort. I think the group that was taking kind of the front lines for Herrera were called Frontera Fund in the Rio Grande Valley. So I think we should be keeping our eye on who's on the front lines and following and being co-conspirators in that sense, rather than those of us in New York and those of us, and maybe those of us who have not been particularly involved in abortion activism, and those who maybe weren't involved in any sort of radical activism, but this will be a turning point, should be looking to, not trying to pretend that we, not centering ourselves, not presuming that we know how to organize around this if we haven't been doing that. People have.
In terms of street protests, some people were talking about the so-called Muslim ban that happened right when Trump came into office, and everybody went out and flooded the airports. I think what's a little different with this is that it's sort of a question of where do you kind of direct that energy? Because obviously there's the Supreme Court, but that's just a building.
Yeah, buildings that are also supporting abortion, certain courts that are always standing by abortion. So no, it's tricky, and I think this is a problem in moments of outrage or moments of rage, often where it's not clear where to direct what would be kind of street energies, which I think are always important. It's not an accident that a lot of the advice of feminists in pro-abortion protests in Latin America were well, we stayed in the streets. We stayed in the streets. And if you have great, great numbers and you are shutting the flows of a city down, it's sort of irrelevant which building you're specifically standing at, if it's a question of shutting down infrastructures, shutting down the ability for a given metropolis or area to function as normal. This we know. But we're not talking about those kind of active radical numbers at this point. The airport protests around the Muslim ban made absolute sense, as you say, because, the airport was the site of violence, right? The airport was where a lot of these, some people, so much capital is allowed to flow, and other people are, held back, restricted, arrested, or moved along against their will. So these are those kind of important intersection points, which it's not always so obvious with something, like an abortion ban. I think, obviously, those who are on the ground in certain areas being able to create protective barriers in the streets when people are trying to get abortions, if they're being harassed, and this is not a new tactic, remains crucial. I think for those who, I don't think it's worthless to not be harassing senators, as people have been, like Manchin and Sinema, who are holding up the filibuster. They're not the only problem here. The entire Democratic leadership is the problem, but, they are in power for, some more months, and I think deserve, I'm not talking about polite protests. I'm talking about, making it more uncomfortable for them to be so feckless than to act at all. And then, but yeah, in places like New York, when it comes to street protests, we're not talking about vast numbers, it's not clear what the kind of shutting down would look like. Which kind of processes are we trying to shut down in terms of assisting people who can't get abortions to get abortions? So maybe in certain cities, if we're not talking about huge mass uprisings level, ongoing shut it all down protests, and to be honest, I don't think we are, then maybe, yeah, like the march, the rally, the protest is not the tactic for this particular issue.
They're not just coming for reproductive freedom, they're coming for everything that they can go after that kind of connects to that, gay marriage, everything.
Oh, right, yeah, exactly. And I mean, one crucial thing when we're talking about the entirety of the fascistic right-wing agenda is, there's a lot of talk now specifically based on the leaked SCOTUS opinion by Scalia, because he made a point of referencing Lawrence versus Texas, which invalidated anti-sodomy laws, of course, Obergefell and Hodges, which legalized same-sex marriage. They were specifically noted by Justice Scalia, and he said none of these rights has any claim to being deeply rooted in history. And as he applied that same logic to Roe, but what that makes unambiguously clear is what he means by any rights that can function at all. Any rights with deep rooting in history are only the rights, as relates to at the birth of this racist nation. So we're talking about rights that protect property, patriarchy, whiteness. Of course, anything but that is under attack and coming under attack. But crucially, I want to emphasize that already under the most violent attack are the lives of trans people and trans youth in particular. If people are worried about the futural attacks on same-sex marriage, that's valid. But to pretend that this isn't already happening at a most extraordinary speed and degree to trans kids would be to, really, really fail. And it would be disgraceful. And I think this needs a focus too. And they come together, right? These are not separate fights. These are fights against, the building of a agenda which is succeeding in terms of protecting white standing and patriarchy, and total control of our bodies and total decimation of bodily autonomy. Forced birth to me is as violent as, a forced puberty into a gender that you don't want to live in. And I think if we don't see these violences together, that would be very foolish, because certainly the far right sees them together. And that's why it's no accident that all these anti-abortion laws, state attacks on trans lives, and state attacks on, educating people around this nation's racist history, have all come together. They're all coming together, and they're all coming from, the same think tanks like Heritage Foundation that write this model legislation. So they are on a kind of unified attack. And if we don't see these things as interconnected, and if we throw trans kids under the bus, well, shame on us.
You're listening to It's Going Down, part of the Channel Zero Anarchist Podcast Network. Follow us online at itsgoingdown.org and on Twitter at IGD_news. If you like and appreciate this podcast, go to itsgoingdown.org/shop and give us a one-time donation. Sign up to donate monthly or donate through Bitcoin. Again, that's itsgoingdown.org/shop to support. And now, back to the show. in the United States, it's like, 2/3 of the population supports abortion access and abortion rights. It's like, this isn't something that's like a not a popular position.
Right. No, and same with, universal healthcare and student debt cancellation. Like this is the nature of minority rule, which is what we have. And which is also why, I think we can fairly have very little patience to, liberals rending at their clothes saying, oh, but our democracy, the social contract is broken. Like, what social contract? Like, the right calls upon this kind of mythical US history, that they want this kind of like ultra-nationalistic sets of rebirth, as their ideology. But this liberal sense of like what became of this great democracy, and pointing to kind of notions of like rights that have never really been enabled to exist, and the democracy that they imagine somehow existed but never has, makes you kind of acutely aware that they don't seem to know what the stakes are right now, and what country they have been living in. So it's easy to roll our eyes and be frustrated, as we should. I don't think, we need to have endless patience, but, this might be a moment of reckoning, for that kind of specific demographic of people. Will it necessarily be? I don't know. Like, if you look on Twitter, there's still a lot of, vote, and it's Susan Sarandon's fault for some reason. Something, 2016, something. So, if I sound cynical, that's, I guess because I am, but I don't think that means we shouldn't be, making moves, being together, strategizing, and thinking about what we can immediately do. I'm just not expecting a kind of huge groundswell of, liberals joining the ranks.
Well, anything else you want to talk about? Again, we want to encourage people to read your article on the Intercept.
I think you mentioned this when you were speaking to your previous guest, who knows more about law than I do, but I do think it's important to keep an eye on the ways in which once Roe is completely undone, there are going to be this kind of unprecedented interstate, interjurisdictional conflicts between, what gets codified on a state level to protect abortion in one state, or to criminalize and prosecute it in another. And there's going to be a lot of clashes in these and legal gray areas and chaos. And I think, we should be looking for those openings and looking to take advantage where we can in this really difficult situation. But I'm going to be continuing to write about this, and continuing to pay a lot of attention to attacks on trans youth and trans lives in general, as I think we all should be. I just think keep an eye on those in the front lines, and figure out how those networks can be built, rather than presuming we have to do it all from scratch.
So it's a scary situation.
Yeah, it's going to be a weird moment. And, in blue states, you've already seen that Connecticut, the Connecticut State House, they passed a law specifically designed to protect abortion providers and, aiders, who could and would offer their services to someone who had maybe kind of left a red state with an abortion ban to find refuge and access there. So, blue states will be hopefully following Connecticut's lead and making these kind of state laws to protect. And then, as you say, there will be, Mississippi law trying to particularly prosecute that out-of-state person. So there will be a lot of interjurisdictional conflict, and it's interesting and will be chaotic, which is sort of ironic, because one of the right-wing lines has been that for decades now is that Roe makes national abortion law more chaotic, and has made it more chaotic. And it's like, you haven't seen chaos from what we're about to see in terms of state court, interstate court conflict. But, you know, sometimes those of us who aren't relying on the kind of hand of juridical power to save us, find spaces of solidarity in those openings and those gaps and in the chaos. And I think we're going to have to.
Awesome. Well, anything else you want to say, or if you want to encourage people to follow you online?
They would like to. It's just Natasha Lennard on Twitter, and it has 2 N's.
This has been the It's Going Down podcast. Check itsgoingdown.org for daily updates, columns, action reports, and news. Go to itsgoingdown.org/shop to support us, and follow us on all social media platforms. IGD, your daily resource for insurgent proletarian life.